I'm really impressed that you guys are all here tonight. I think probably in several hours we'll all be stuck wherever we are for just a bit. So I'm really glad that you guys are here. We have a lot of stuff to cover tonight. And I actually think we'll just pray before we get started, and then I will hand it over here in a minute. My head feels a little cluttered today with all the changes that have happened today on my schedule and tomorrow on my schedule. So if you guys will just indulge me, I'm going to pray to see if we can get a little settled here and take a deep breath. Heavenly Father, we're so grateful for this time. I am personally so grateful for every single person in this room and just the commitment and the dedication that they have shown over these past few weeks. God, thank you for them. I just ask that during this time tonight that our hearts would be stilled and our minds would be open. Holy Spirit, would you minister to us in this room? Would you bring clarity about your word in an academic, scholarly way? But more importantly, God, would you speak to our hearts? Would you let this penetrate our heads so that it makes a difference in the way that we see you and therefore the way that we act and react in our daily lives? Thank you for this church. Thank you for its leadership. Thank you that it's growing and that we get to be a part. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so we have quite a bit, as I said, to cover this evening, and I want to point out just a couple of things that you might have noticed in your homework this week. Before I hand things over to Glenn, I'll introduce you guys to Glenn in just a minute, but I want to point out a few things. So we're about to look at both books, and my favorite little diagram, which is the chart diagram that's after your syllabus. I'm sorry, I've already messed with. Oh, and the battery came out. Sorry about that. So it's this chart that's the one just after your syllabus, okay? You may or may not have noticed this, but this is where the biblical narrative, where we are right now in the biblical narrative, is where labeling things gets a little dicey and gets a little confusing, perhaps. I see some of you doing this. Like, yes, our one book said one thing and one book said another thing, and this says something else completely. And if you look at the notes from week 1 that I gave you, Esther's just left off completely. So, I mean, that book just doesn't even exist according to what I gave you, which was obviously my error. So I want to talk for just a second about these different ways to label things and categorize things, because I said from the very beginning that I find that to be very important, that you know where we are in the structure of things as well as in the story of things. And I think Glenn's going to cover some of that as well. But I just wanted to show you, so on the top part of this chart that says the story of how the Bible is organized. So last time we did the law. This time you can see that we are in the history books. Okay, and that's the top one is how we organized for this particular class. But if you look underneath in the 4-part framework of the Bible, you'll notice that we are going to start today with the conquests because we are going to be in Joshua. That's where we're going to start when it comes to the order of the books of the Bible. Does that make sense? So far we've had Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth. And then if you head over into the divided kingdom, you're going to see things from a timeline perspective start to get mixed up for the first time. So if you look at the table of contents in your Bible, and then you look at this timeline framework that we're looking at here, do you notice how we're under the United Kingdom and the divided kingdom? And you've got 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. What comes next if you're looking at the table of contents in your Bible? 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, Psalms. Do you see how those things are split into a couple of different columns on this bottom structure, this bottom 4-part structure? So Glenn's going to really talk through tonight a little bit of the story of that, but I just wanted you guys to know that those things are not contradicting one another. One is not the right way and one is not the wrong way. It's just that things are labeled differently because sometimes things fit into different places in your how to read the Bible book by book, I think these guys are the smartest because everything that we're covering tonight, you know what they just call it? The story of Israel for the win. They don't further subdivide it. In the yellow book, it gets subdivided into judges and conquests and the exile. Well, kingdoms first, and then the exile, and then the return. So it's fine to subdivide those things. Whatever works for you is fine. I just wanted you guys to be aware that except for the fact that I left Esther off my chart on the first week that I taught, all of these things are just different ways to put some of, to categorize and chart the different eras that we are currently in, okay? The important part is that you kind of understand why the overlap happens and why they're all okay. And I think that will become clear tonight as Glenn presents his information. So without further ado, I want to introduce you guys to Glenn Daves. And first of all, just say, Glenn, thank you. Glenn agreed to teach for us here in the Institute before I told him what section I was giving him. And so that tells you as much about his heart as you need to know. He's been here at Austin Ridge since 2008. He's an engineer by training, but he has his degree from Alliance Seminary. He and his wife, Carol, have been life group leaders here since 2008. And so they together and separately have served the body for a very long time. And we are very grateful that you have agreed to take on this crazy task of going through the books of the kingdoms and the exile and the history and all the different things that this gets called. So you guys welcome Dave. Glenn Daves.
Thank you. Oh, I'm a little loud. Can somebody turn me down? So what Lori didn't say was when I found out which part I was going to teach, this is the best part. So I was like, yes. So anyway, I'm really excited to cover this stuff. So history, people who love history. Okay, a few. People who do love history, for that subset, who loves the dates of history, all the key dates? No, okay. So we're going to be talking about dates. We're going to be talking about history, but sometimes you can get lost in that. And so we're also going to try to kind of pull out, what's Lori said, there's the scuba diver, but we're going to be like skimming across the waves, okay, today, because there's a lot here. But I want to start just with kind of a story. So I'm in London, and I'm in the British Museum. And the reason I'm there is because my seminary professor said I should go there. And I was like, okay. So I got this trip to London, and so I'm in the British Museum. And I'm staring at this. Did I lose my pairing here after my battery came out? Well, let's do it this way. Okay, so I'm staring at this. This is the obelisk of Shalmaneser III in the British Museum, okay? And it's black obsidian. Shalmaneser he's the king of Assyria, giant empire that conquered the world. And out of black obsidian, he has this thing carved, right? And so on, it goes around and around and around, these carvings of the obelisk. Anybody been to the British Museum? Anybody seen the obelisk of Shalmaneser? It's the most awesome thing there. Anyway, but you see these carvings in the obelisk, okay? And then, somebody has helpfully drawn them out so you can see it a little bit more clearly. And right here is this guy. So here's Shalmaneser, okay? And here's this guy. And he is prostrate before Shalmaneser, okay? And so this guy is Jehu, king of Israel. And this is Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, okay? And these are all the Israelites, these guys here, bringing tribute to pay to Shalmaneser, okay? And so if we close up on Jehu here and spin it around so you can see him a little better, there is Jehu, king of Israel. This is the only contemporary image of a Bible character in the entire Bible. This image was made right about the time he lived. There is no other image, Jesus, Paul, you name it, there's no other image contemporary made of a Bible character except for this one. Okay? So I'm I'm sitting there, right? And I'm saying, wow, look at this obelisk, and it's black, and I peer in, and I'm looking at the picture. And you got to understand the setting, because the setting is this giant room, okay? And the giant room is full of the, like all of the decorations from the palace there of Nineveh, the capital of Assyria. And so there's all these guys with those, those beards like this. All these carvings of guys with beards like that attached to horses' bodies. I have no idea, probably some Assyrian god, right? And it's incredible. And it's all over. The British owned like the whole world, right? And then they decided to take chainsaws and like cut down the whole world and move it to London. So there's like an entire Greek temple there. There's like all this stuff from Egypt. And there's all the stuff from Nineveh are in the British Museum in London. So anyway, I'm in this room, and I'm looking at all this stuff from Assyria, and now confession time. I'm in seminary. Why do you go to seminary? You go to seminary because I've been a Christian 10 years at that point. I think I know something about the Bible. I think I know something about God. And so I decided to go to seminary. And now here I am in this giant room, okay? And for the first time in my life, it clicked. Like before then, Bible stories, you read through 1st and 2nd Kings and you read through Samuel, and it's a Bible story. And because I'm an evangelical Christian, I think, well, okay, it's true. I believe that this is true. But I believed it was true as sort of a matter of faith. And I believed it was true, and it's an important thing I could learn from as a matter of my faith, that the Bible is a good book to read, and you can learn a lot from it. But here I am in this room staring at the image of Jehu, and I go, this really happened. This guy really lived. This king really forced Israel into submission and made them pay tribute. And here's the stuff from his castle that he's lived in. And for the first time, it clicked. I'd been learning about the archaeology. I've been learning about all this. But suddenly, it's like, it's not a Bible story. This is just what really happened. That's history. And that's what the Bible contains. So we're going to touch on a lot of that tonight as we go through, as we skim across the waves. But understand, go to the British Museum and you'll understand better that when you read, they're not just stories. This is history. This is stuff that really happened, people who really lived, conversations that really occurred. And that's what we're going to be studying, and that's what the Bible contains. That's why it's such an incredible book. Okay, so this is, by the way, because Joey did a test last week, you'll see in your notes, I have all these dates. We're going to be tested on those at the end of the night. No, I'm kidding. But there's a bunch of dates, and we're not going to really cover the dates actually, except on this one chart. But I wanted it in there as a reference for you, and just my key, sort of key dates that I pulled out. So, but I did want to spend a little bit of time here because I called it Superpower Politics in the Hand of God. Okay, so the world that we're talking about, and what are we talking about? We're talking about 1500 BC to around 300 BC, so 1200 years. Oh, by the way, a little shorthand, cheaters way to Bible timeline. Okay, when did Abraham live? Answer, 2000 BC. When did King David live? Answer, 1000 BC. Okay, so those are two key people, Abraham, King David, 1,000 years apart. When did Jesus live? 0 BC, right? So this is a simple Bible timeline. Then you divide that in half. What happened around 1500 BC? Answer is the Exodus, more or less. What happened at 500 BC? And the return from exile happened around 500 BC. So it's just so Abraham 2000, Exodus 1500, not really, But David, 1,000, return 500, Jesus, 0. Okay? So real simple, 500-year increments of big Bible events. All right, so the world at this time, this is the world, by the way. At least that's what these people thought the world was. You could maybe draw the map a little bit bigger down to Ethiopia, a little bit over, maybe a little bit into India, certainly the rest of Anatolia and into Greece. That was the world, okay? Outside of that area, this is remember in school the Fertile Crescent? This is the Fertile Crescent where civilization really began. Outside of that, the people who lived in this area, they thought, yeah, there's land out there, and there's people who live out there, but there's no kingdoms. They're just like tribes and just little people, kind of unassociated people that live out there in the hinterlands, okay? I could make a joke about West Texas, but I will refrain. Right, it's just out there. So, yeah, there's land, yeah, there's people, but this is the world. This is where civilization is. This is where kingdoms are. And so these people really thought this was the world, okay? And so the world at that time, their conception, was really, there were always two superpowers in the world, the U.S. and the USSR. No. It was always Egypt and somebody else. And so in your notes I say Egypt and X, because somebody else kept changing. And you'll see them in here. It's Egypt and the Hittite Empire. It's Egypt and the Assyrian Empire. It's Egypt and the Babylonian Empire. And then you could kind of say it's Egypt and Persia and kind of Egypt and Greece, but by that time Egypt was kind of just a conquered puppet nation. But the world is always bimodal. There's two great powers in the world in this whole period of time, but the one power is always Egypt. The other power keeps changing, okay? And so Egypt was constantly fighting these guys. Now, here's Egypt, okay? And there's these different regions on the map. So I have Mesopotamia, kind of big region names, Lower Anatolia, the Anatolian, present-day Turkey is the Anatolian Peninsula. I decided just to call Lower Anatolia because the Hittite Empire didn't actually occupy the entire Anatolian Peninsula. There's Canaan. Oh, this is supposed to be a seminary level class, so the first thing they teach you is seminaries you don't know anything, so that word is not pronounced Canaan. It's Canaan, okay? That double A is always ah. So it's not Baal, it's Baal, okay? So anyway, Canaan. And then the Levant region. So this is just this, today it's present Syria and Jordan and stuff like that, the Levant region, okay? And actually, Canaan is part of the Levant region, but I split it out because that's kind of our key place, right? Okay, so it's always Egypt versus somebody out here. So the Hittite Empire, if we look at 1500 BC, Egypt is fighting the Hittite Empire. Assyria is there, by the way. They're out here, but they're kind of small and weak at that point. And the Hittite Empire is big. But okay, so if the Hittite Empire is here and Egypt is here, how does Egypt attack the Hittite Empire? How does the Hittite Empire attack Egypt? Answer is you got to go through the Levant. There's two key ways to get through the Levant. You can travel up the coast because it's a mountainous region. You can travel up the coast, or there's a rift valley, so kind of between mountain ranges where the Dead Sea is here. You can travel up the Rift Valley, okay? There's only two ways through. And so those two key roads and highways were the key to this whole region, those two paths through. And armies went back and forth, and traders went back and forth. And, this was a really key area, but it was sort of also beside the point because Egypt's just trying to get its army up to the Hittites, or Egypt's just trying to get it, or Assyria is just trying to get its army to Egypt. So it's got to march through here. So these guys are just sort of in the way between the superpowers that are battling. And remember USSR and the US, right? So you've got NATO and the Warsaw Pact. And so we're even talking about it today with Ukraine. What does the USSR want? Well, they want buffer. They want to be protected from the enemy. So they build this Warsaw Pact of little nations in the way. They're independent, kind of puppet nations. They're in the way. And so that's what this region was for the superpowers. They're little nations that are buffers between the armies, so they aren't constantly at war. Okay? All right, so if we look through history, so we have Egypt and battling with the Hittite emperor, which is here for a long time. And then finally, Egypt wins, and they conquer the Hittite Empire. They rule the world. Again, they know that there's more of the world there. I mean, Assyria is there at that point, but they basically conquer the world. They're the one dominant power on planet Earth. And then they recede into themselves. And as they recede, you start getting all these small kingdoms in the Levant form. And again, they're sort of blowing past all this stuff, everything in Canaan at this time. They're sort of blowing past, just focused on the Hittites. And then they just recede. And suddenly the Levant grows. And all these nations form: Moab, Edom, Midian, all these things we read about in the Bible. These are all little city-states in here. Aram, another good one, present-day Syria. But Assyria grows and grows and grows and grows. I'm talking about the superpower stuff. I'm kind of not focused on this part now. Assyria grows and grows and grows, gets more powerful, more powerful, more powerful. Suddenly starts scaring all these small kingdoms, of which Israel is one of them. And then there's the great battle of Karkar, right? 853? Something like that. Where 12 united kingdoms fight the armies of Assyria and win. Sort of a Pyrrhic victory, so everybody gets hurt in it, but it keeps Assyria at bay for another several decades until finally everyone gets swept away because of the might of Assyria, our guy Shalmaneser and Sargon and all these other guys. And then Assyria finally fights the big battle with Egypt. They conquer all of this, basically get them out of the way so they can get at Egypt. These guys are afterthoughts, little weak nations. And Egypt is conquered by Assyria. Boom. And then Assyria suddenly falls into internal chaos. And a little country over here called Babylon suddenly rebels against the Assyrian Empire and starts to grow and grow and grow. And so, again, Assyria conquers the world. And just a few years later, Babylon totally wipes them out. The Battle of Carchemish, huge battle. By the way, those two battles, Karkar and Carchemish, are really solid dates. A lot of all the other dates that we know are relative to those two battles because there's lots written about them and everybody triangulates, so you know that it was in the 5th year of that king and the 16th year of that king, and so you can put everything together because of these battles. And so that's why I put them in there. Anyway, Babylon conquers Assyria in the Battle of Carchemish. Egypt is at that point allied. They're sort of a puppet kingdom. So Babylon defeats Egypt. Babylon defeats Assyria. Babylon rules the world for 60 years. When a couple of guys up here, called the Medes, decide they like that land too. And suddenly they sweep, after only 60 years, they sweep Babylon away and Persia takes over. And so another Mesopotamian power. Persia lasts for 200 years. And then this guy named Alexander says, I'd just kind of like to conquer the world, and proceeds to do it. And what happens to Alexander? At his death, his kingdom doesn't last, and it splits up, and it goes on and on and on, all this history, okay? All right, so hopefully what I'm trying to make the point is there's these superpowers in the world, and what we read in the Bible is mostly not that, but they do get impacted because the armies keep marching through. And so sometimes the armies are attacking Israel, but it's only because they're on their way to Egypt, and Israel's just an annoyance in their way, okay? All right, so let's talk about Israel now. So at this time, I haven't talked about Bronze Age, Iron Age. That's a key epoch here, right? So Bronze Age lasts till 1200, and then 1250, and then people start being Iron Age. But it's not like everybody had iron technology at that time. We'll talk about that as we go on. But this is about when Iron Age started. And oh, by the way, that's the age we live in now, right? That's still our primary metal is iron. So it's still going on. All right, so Egypt is focused so much on fighting the Hittites, that they kind of let this region, especially in Canaan, just kind of do what they want, and all these little city-states form. So just small little kingdoms are built around a city. And that's right when the Exodus happens, just shortly thereafter, around 1450 to 1250, depending on some different scholars date it different ways. And you had these Israeli tribes that travel from Egypt through the Sinai for 40 years and into Canaan. And we have the period of the judges that we're going to talk about. And that lasts for a long time. Hundreds of years of judges. And then a guy named Saul comes along, who's the first king of Israel. But Saul's kingdom does not last. He rules 40 years. His kingdom does not last. And a guy named David is anointed king. And so here is the kingdom of Saul, and then David, and then Solomon, a united kingdom that it has all of this region. They progressively conquer all that region of Canaan. And then Solomon dies. The temple has already been built. Solomon dies, and his son Rehoboam is born, and Rehoboam says, man, I got big shoes to fill. And you guys know this story, right? As soon as Rehoboam's king, they're like, man, Solomon killed us. He built all these cities. He built the temple. Please, you got to lighten up. And Rehoboam takes a counsel, right? And he takes counsel with two groups of people, his buddies. And his buddies say, if your father was mean, you got to be more mean. And then he goes to the old wise men, and the old wise men said, no, your father was pretty mean. You got to lighten up. And so he takes the advice of the young men. And so Jeroboam comes, and 10 of the tribes of Israel go after Jeroboam. And there's now a divided kingdom. There's the kingdom of Judah, ruled by Rehoboam in the south of Canaan. And then there's the kingdom of Israel. So 2 tribes and 10 tribes is in the north of Israel. And so that lasts a long time. And we'll talk about this more. So hundreds of years. This one's 200 and change. This one's 300 and change. This one, Israel, the northern kingdom, is wiped out by Assyria on their way to Egypt. But Judah survives until the Babylonians wipe out Assyria. And you can see Egypt is still is now independent again, even though they had been conquered. Egypt's suddenly independent. Babylon, by the way, never fully defeats Egypt. So they didn't fully conquer the world, but they almost did. They pushed Egypt way back into submission. But on their way to Egypt, they take out the kingdom of Judah. And that is the end. Assyria takes 10 tribes into exile, and we never see those 10 tribes again. The 2 tribes go into exile into Babylon, and those around 500 BC return. Okay? Under Persia's rule. And then we know what happens when Macedon and Alexander come along. All right, that's history in a nutshell. That's a lot that I just went through. That might be the driest part of what we're going to talk about tonight. But here's what I want you would really understand is I have in your notes some theological observations, okay? So in that little spiel that I just gave you, first and foremost, I want you to realize that those small kingdoms only exist. All of these small kingdoms in this little area only exist because the superpowers allow it to happen. They could take them out like that because there's great powers and there's, why pick a small kingdom, Tahiti. Why does the U.S. let the kingdom of Tahiti exist? Because we want to. We just choose to. We could take them out like that, right? It would be no problem to conquer Tahiti. Maybe we should. Anyway, but But it's only at the will of the superpowers that these things exist at all. But who controls the will of the superpowers? And the answer is God. God's hand. I mean, those kingdoms only exist because of the grace of God, because they're powerless against those superpowers in the end. Next thing, pride goes before a fall. So when you look at that grand sweep of history, and we know what happens to Macedon and Greece, and we know what happens to Rome, and we know what happens to all the guys that follow, the Ottoman Empire, pride goes before a fall. So Israel, this is a great one. So Israel was founded by Jeroboam, King Jeroboam, okay? He was the first king of Israel. One of the last kings of Israel was also named Jeroboam. So you got Jeroboam the first, Jeroboam the second. They're not related at all, different bloodlines, different dynasties. Jeroboam the second grows Israel to its largest extent. They win some key battles, and they win battles against Judah in the south. They start expanding north towards the Phoenicians, and they start expanding. So it's their biggest wealth, their most impressive territory size. They're at their most powerful. And 24 years later, Assyria says enough. And the prophets, who's doing prophets? Who's teaching on prophets? Brett's going to tell you, the prophets say, warn them, warn Israel. The way you're living, the pride with which you're living, your disregard for the poor, the way, this excess of your living because they're rich and wealthy and powerful, God's not happy with you. And 24 years later, God acts by the hand of Assyria. Assyria conquers the world. 60 years later, it conquers the world and falls into disarray and is taken out by Babylon 60 years later. Babylon conquers the world. 60 years later, taken out by Persia. How do you conquer the world, be the most powerful single nation on planet Earth, and be gone in 60 years? Persia conquers the world. 200 years later, a guy named Alexander comes along. Alexander, his empire doesn't survive him. There's hubris in these empires, and history teaches us that God deals with hubris in a pretty dramatic way, and that these empires really are just pawns. If God's not pleased with what Judah is doing, here comes an army of Assyria. So God just moves these empires active in Israel's life. And by the way, he's doing that today. The U.S., Russia, China, pick the country. They're just pawns. God works his will through nations. And God can suddenly change the status of nations, as we see. Bang, bang, bang. Okay, so that's the grand sweep. And hopefully that, I don't know. So you could look up all the individual maps of how these empires, I love maps, by the way. How you can grow and shrink these empires. You see them grow over time in these historical maps, and they shrink back down. So you can do all that. But this is my little shorthand way of dealing with it. What I want to do next is start going book by book through what we've got. Okay? So we've got a bunch of books. Joshua is the first one. Joshua is a book of the conquest. So Moses dies. He's not allowed to enter the promised land. And Joshua is appointed as his successor, okay? And as Joshua moves in, there's a couple key points that I wanted to make. So if you look at your notes, the first one is that it's very clear when you read the book of Joshua, and it's said over and over, I have a couple of references here, but God gives the land to Israel. By the way, this was promised. Land is part of the promise back from Genesis. God promised Abraham, I'm going to give you this land. It happened, 500 years later, but it happened. And God gave Israel the land. God drove out the peoples in front of Israel's armies. In fact, when they talk to people, the Israelites say, "What's up with you guys?" And people will say in the book of Joshua, the hearts of our soldiers have melted. No one can stand before you. So they had no morale in their armies, and so Israel could just move in. So what does it look like for God to give Israel the land? What does God's gift look like? And here's what it looks like when you read the book. Joshua has to make battle plans. Joshua has to lead his army. Joshua has to conclude treaties with various city-states. And Joshua has to very carefully administer all this land that he's conquering and carefully divide it up and administer this kingdom he's now, or this country he's now come into possession of. And so what's really weird is that Joshua will say, I had to train the army. Yeah, we had to come up with the battle plan. Yeah, that first battle plan didn't work, so we came up with the second battle plan. Yeah, we had to decide, should we go north or south on this, go after this guy next or the other guy next. And all of that process, the definition of that is God giving you the land. That's God's action, even though it's really interesting that God's action infuses our action. And by the way, if God's not there infusing our action, it doesn't matter how much you train the army or how good your battle plan is. But you still have to train the army and come up with a good battle plan. Joshua emphasizes to Israel over and over again the importance of covenant loyalty. And there's a famous battle of Ai, which somebody, one of the guys disobeys, and God removes his favor from Israel. And so this is a huge teaching moment. Like, no, God is teaching Israel, I mean this stuff, and you need to do it. And so they take care of the sin in their midst, and God continues to bless. The other thing that's important to note, conquest of Canaan was incomplete during Joshua's lifetime. So they never finished it during Joshua's lifetime. It took later generations to finish the conquest. And then, by the way, I didn't even talk about in the map, but after the founding of Israel, these other guys start showing up called the Philistines. And they're part of the great Sea Peoples invasion. So the Philistines were part of these peoples that came in and started invading coastal areas all over the world. And that was one of them. So we'll talk about them a little bit more. Okay, we got to move on. Last one that I want to talk about is Joshua lived to be 110 years old. This is a really cool thing. So, and why is it cool? So there were 11 pharaohs that also lived to be 110 years old. Okay? And also Joseph with the many-colored coat, that guy in the Bible, he lived to be 110 years old. Okay? As best we can tell, we know is that from reading the hieroglyphics and all these inscriptions in Egypt is that lived to be 110 years old is an ancient Egyptian idiom that means accomplished all he set out to do in life or something like that, was a success with his life. And it's kind of interesting that two guys in the Bible with very close ties to Egypt, Joseph and Joshua, have this same age as these 11 pharaohs that accomplished all they set out to do in life. So what's neat is that, sometimes you run into criticism of liberal Christians or scholars will say, well, the Bible's not really true or this, or it was written much later. And then you point to that and you go, okay, so Napoleon found the Rosetta Stone, his army in Egypt in around 10 or something? He's in Egypt, 1805, and they find the Rosetta Stone. It took him like 25 years to figure out how to read hieroglyphics based on the Rosetta Stone. So now you're in like 1825. Give it another 10 years, 1835, before the science of Egyptology really starts to take hold. So now you're mid-1800s when people are finally in the Egyptian desert reading all the hieroglyphics. Then it takes the scholars another decade or two to really collate this and go, hey, yeah, didn't somebody else live to be 110 years old? So now you're like the late 1800s when it finally dawns on us that the Bible contains an ancient Egyptian idiom that's 3,000 years old that no one knew was there. The Bible is a book of the age it claims to be. It contains, and there's lots of these examples where you can prove without a shadow of doubt that this book is an ancient book of the age it claims to be, written by people in those exact cultures of that it claims. And so they've found all kinds of archaeological finds that really demonstrate that. It's really cool. But anyway, so that's one little tidbit from Joshua. Judges, long period of time. Okay? So again, historically, this is hundreds of years. In the Bible, it's 7 cycles. And there's 12 judges over 7 cycles. Okay? Now, what is a judge? A judge is not a king. A judge is just sort of a military leader who saves Israel. And Israel gets in these 7 cycles. So what is the cycle is? Israel is faithful. And then Israel gets fat, dumb, and happy. And they start to fall away from God. And they start worshiping the gods of the land, of the people that they threw out. And then generally it's the Philistines. Sometimes it's other guys. But then some outside nation attacks and wins and oppresses Israel. And oppresses means, their army marches through once a year and takes all your grain. Good luck to you. So really brutal. And then Israel cries out to God and says, we've sinned, we have no grain, please help. God raises up a judge, and that judge pulls together the armies of Israel, all the different scattered clans, and leads them to victory, which leads people to praise God and be faithful to God, and then the cycle starts over again. And that happens 7 times. There's 7 of these cycles in the book. By the way, we all know that's the cycle of our lives too, right? When we're prosperous, when we're close to God, we need to be careful lest we fall and find ourselves oppressed and crying out to God. Another key quote twice in the book. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So this was, why did Israel end up in a kingdom? Part of it was because of this observation. There's no laws, there's no real, there's nothing holding society together. There's this common religion, but it wasn't sufficient in the eyes of the people. Deborah is one of the judges. One of those 12 judges is a woman. So that's really astounding in a patriarchal society. That a woman can judge Israel and be a military leader and a political leader in Israel. And there are these dots throughout the Bible of women in prominent positions. So sometimes we think that, male-led church, male-led whatever from the beginning of time. And it's mostly been that way, but not always that way. And so there are always these exceptions to the rules. And God is the author of these exceptions. He raises up Deborah to lead Israel. Philistines. So again, the Philistines, they invade. I'm going to go back to that map. So the Philistines invade all around this area, right? They're the sea peoples. They're called the Philistines when they land in Gaza and start conquering this coastal area. And so they were very successful everywhere they landed. And the reason is they were Iron Age people when everybody else was Bronze Age. So their weapons were a lot better. So they had a military advantage. Wrong way. Ruth. Ruth is a foreigner from Moab, one of those small kingdoms in the Levant. This is another exception to the rule, by the way, because God always says don't intermarry with these peoples because they're gonna draw you away from me. But nonetheless, she's a foreigner. She's from Moab. She is included in the line of David and eventually Jesus, right? And so what that means is that's good news. Way back in the beginning, in the time of the judges, already there's a hint that Gentiles are part of God's plan. And Ruth's profession of faith is profound. She tells Naomi, where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people. Your God, my God. That is a pretty cool profession of faith. And again, I think is the key to Ruth's inclusion into the promise. How are we doing on time here? I think we're doing well. I think I'm going to do 1st and 2nd Samuel, then we're going to take a break. Okay? All right, 1st and 2nd Samuel, because 1st and 2nd Kings, we got a lot to talk about. 1st and 2nd Samuel is the book of David. Okay, it's called Samuel, but it's really about David. Or it's mostly about David. It's originally a single scroll in the Old Testament. So, when it was being written on scrolls, those were together. It was, all these books got divided, by the way, in the Septuagint. Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. So, fast forward several hundred years, Alexander conquers the world, and everybody at that point has to speak Greek. Okay, so the whole world speaks Greek at that point. In fact, even long after Alexander's gone, the whole world speaks Greek. Roman Empire, the primary language is Greek. The official language is Latin, but the language of the people, the language that everybody speaks, the international language is Greek. Just like English is the international language today. I travel on business all the time, and everywhere you go in the world, everybody speaks English at business meetings because that is the common international language. Good thing I'm an American because that's the only one I speak. But, so Greek is the international language. Nobody can read the Bible anymore. Nobody can, because it's in Hebrew and Aramaic, the languages of the Old Testament, and so they translate it into Greek. And in that translation, they decide to separate 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings. They all get divided because it made it easier because they were making books at that point instead of scrolls. What's interesting about Samuel is I said it's a book about David because David is the crescendo of Samuel. It all builds up. There's this promise. Samuel is a prophet. He's the child of promise, a miracle child, miracle baby. And he grows, and finally he anoints Saul as king over Israel because Israel cries out. By the way, God's not happy about that. Even in Judges, people wanted a king. And there was reason for it because everybody did as he wanted. So they thought the solution was a king. God thought, no, I am your solution, but I will give you a king if that's what you really want. And so Saul is selected as a king. He's anointed and selected by God, anointed by Samuel. And it doesn't go very well. He's not a great king. We find out that leaders are flawed people. And so David becomes king after Saul. After Saul his family is wiped out, basically. Interestingly, David is not a perfect man either. Saul is a flawed man. David is a flawed man. But David is a man after God's own heart. That's the quote, right? 1 Samuel. Samuel tells Saul, you're not going to be king anymore. God has sought a man after his own heart. So this is why we say this about David. But David is also a man who is sinful. Saul's a man who's sinful. What's the difference? I've laid it out there. If you compare when he's confronted with sin, Saul's reaction in 1 Samuel 15 versus David's reaction when he's confronted with sin in 2 Samuel 12, and in Psalm 51, you see the night and day difference between the hearts of these two men. One guy justifies himself. Yeah, but there's always an excuse. And one guy says, I've sinned. So, and that's the kind of heart that God is looking for in us. Another cool thing. I said the Philistines were Iron Age when everyone else was Bronze Age. 1 Samuel 13 contains the first military non-proliferation attempt recorded. So we're trying to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons today. Back in 1000 BC, they were trying to prevent the proliferation of iron technology. If you, I'll just leave it as a teaser so you can read the non-proliferation attempts in 1 Samuel. All right, let's take a break. Pace yourself. We got a lot more to go. Everybody get coffee.
I searched the world, but it couldn't fill me. Mountains empty praise and treasures of fame are never enough. Then you came along and put me back together. And every desire is now satisfied here in your love. Hey. Oh, there's nothing
All right.
I don't think we're finished yet. Come on. I think he's turning some things over tonight.
All right, we got to turn off the musique.
You turn my morning into
I got to be careful on my camera. All right. First and Second Kings. Boy, is this an incredible. So again, one scroll, all right, divided in the Septuagint later, but originally one scroll. So these things go together. And so this is the incredible book, right? It has the history of. So rewind, right? So we've got. Let's rewind all the way. So God creates Adam and Eve, right? Puts them in the garden. What happens? It's great, and then they sin. So they're thrown out of the garden, but God makes a way for them, right? And so, fast forward to Noah. I can't remember all of Joey's points, but fast forward to Noah, same cycle. We have Babel, same cycle. Babel, Noah, same cycle. No, other way around. So Noah, Babel, same cycle. And then we get into Egypt. We get out of Egypt, and we're in the wilderness. Same cycle. People are grumbling. I wish I was back, a slave in Egypt rather than here free with God. Because I don't like having to trust God. I'd much rather trust in the meager things that I knew were coming from the Egyptians. Same cycle, but God's faithful through all this, right? Even though people sin, God makes a way. He keeps making a way, keeps making a way. He gets them into the promised land, even after everything that goes on. Even after he kills the generation, he gets them in the promised land, and we're at the time of Judges. Same cycle, 7 cycles. And they cry out for a king, so he gives them a king. And so we have David the king, and now we move into 1st and 2nd Kings when we'll see the same cycle over and over and over again. Okay? 1st and 2nd Kings starts with Solomon and ends with the destruction of Judah. So Solomon is David's son by Bathsheba. We all know who Bathsheba was, right? She was the wife of Uriah the Hittite. And so this was an adulterous relationship when it started. But somehow Solomon still becomes king. And because that's how David wants it, that's how God wants it. And even that adulterous thing, God redeems, and that's in the lineage of Jesus too. It's so amazing how God keeps bailing us out over and over and over again. And even our poor choices, he can redeem for good. Key events in this book are, first of all, the building of the temple, the division of the kingdom, which we already talked about, okay? And then the destruction of each of those kingdoms. The key leaders in this book are Solomon, Elijah, Elisha, 2 prophets are in here, and then Jeroboam, the guy, the first Jeroboam the first, is a key pivotal guy, okay, because he divides, is key to dividing Israel. And the key assessment is good or evil. So remember, Judges has 7 cycles. Let's talk about 40 cycles, kind of more like in this book. And so, because it's covering 2 kingdoms, and each king, if you look at this chart, just a real rundown of these 2 kingdoms. So you have the southern kingdom of Judah, 2 tribes. You have the northern kingdom of Israel, 10 tribes. Dynasties, 1. A dynasty, you guys know what a dynasty is? That is, your blood still sits, you're a king and your blood still sits on the throne. Once no one of your blood, direct descendant, sits on the throne, that's a new dynasty. And that can happen if, you never have children, or it can happen if there's an usurper comes in and takes over the throne. So anyway, dynasty Judah, 1, David's dynasty. Israel, 9 dynasties. Started with Jeroboam, but it didn't last long. Jeroboam's dynasty didn't last long. Kings, there's 19 kings, 1 queen, and 1 governor. And in Israel, there's 20 kings. Okay, average reign is 18 years versus 12 years. Assessment. At the end of each one of these stories of each of these kings, there's an assessment, a theological assessment. And it's take your whole life, and the writer boils it down to one of 2 words. You're good or you're evil. And that is it. That is the assessment of your entire life and all your works, with some exceptions. But some were good. Some of the kings of Judah were good, and some were evil. Okay? In Israel, uniformly, every last one was evil. Capital, Jerusalem. By the way, city of David. David took Jerusalem. He conquered it from the Jebusites himself. It had been unconquered territory until that point, until 1000. So Exodus is, 450. So hundreds of years, that little part of Israel was unconquered. David took it, and it was his city. Israel, on the other hand, had Shechem, Penuel, Tirzah, and Samaria. Okay, so 4 different capital cities. Duration, 345 years, 209 years. And captivity, Judah went to Babylon in 4 different stages, 4 successive captivity, where all the elites of Israel were deported to Babylon. In Israel, that kingdom ended after 209 years by Assyria taking them, and they took everybody at once. So, by the way, why? That's an interesting point. I'll just pause on why captivity. And this is how those Mesopotamian empires dealt with. They were empires. They grew by conquering other people. And the way they conquered other people was they felt it was very important to separate people from their gods. And gods in the Mesopotamian mind were local to the land. So like the Canaanite people, the god was Baal, the bull god of fertility, right? And Asherah, always talked about in the Bible, the goddess of fertility, okay? So these two, so you get Baal and Asherah together and good things happen, or that's what people thought, right? But enough with the high places, right, Lori? Because over and over and over again, they think, yeah, God delivered me, but you know what? I'm going to pray to Asherah today. 'Cause that'll make my life better. By the way, we do the same thing, right? That next purchase, that will finally make me feel complete. But anyway, Baal was the god of the Canaanites and is a local god. And in the Assyrian mindset or the Babylonian mindset, Baal was a real guy, but he ruled that little swath of land. And our God is more powerful, but Baal is so what we need to do is we need to take the people from that part of the land and move them over here so that they're separate from their God. And then we'll move people over here and we'll put them there, and then they'll be less powerful because they're separated. And their God's over there, and everybody kind of swaps gods, and that keeps everybody weak. And so that was the philosophy. So they would take the elites and they would move them out. So that's what happened. Assyria came in, they moved all the elites out of the land, and we never saw from them again. Actually, there's one exception. When Jesus is a baby at the temple, a prophetess Anna comes up to him, and just gives thanks to God and tells other people about that she saw this incredible baby. And this is when he's being dedicated at the temple. And she is from the tribe of Asher. That's the only reference to the 10 tribes after the deportation. And then Judah goes to Babylon in 4 stages, but they actually do return because Persia comes back, and King Cyrus and the Persians just have a different idea of how you should do this. Because they're a little bit outside of Mesopotamia, a different view of the world. Okay, so what we see in here is that because Judah, so here the cycle is always the same. It's just deeper and deeper and deeper. The assessment of every king is he was worse than the last. And all that means is he just dug the hole deeper. Just kept digging the hole deeper. So he's worse than the last guy. He didn't make him better, he just made him worse. Okay? More evil than those who had come before him is always the refrain here. And after 209 years and a lot of prophets, God says enough. Here, there's, depending on how you count it, there's like 7 good kings in this lineage. Okay? And 7 kings is worth about, 150 years before God says enough. Cycle after cycle. So they have cycles where they're spinning down, and they'll have a good king that brings them back up and puts away the high places and opens up the temple, and they worship again. They worship the true God again and devote themselves to God again. And then God blesses them, and down they are in the cycle again. Okay? So there's 7 good kings in this queen. The one queen is evil, by the way. Sorry about that, ladies. But she usurps the throne briefly from her children. But shocker to me, and I put this in your notes. Jeroboam, the guy who leads Israel astray, 10 of the 12 tribes astray, and starts the downward spiral for that northern kingdom of Israel. He is selected by a prophet of God, anointed by a prophet of God, and given the charge by the prophet to lead Israel. And not to lead them astray. God doesn't know. He says, hey, I've selected you, and you're king. We'll make you, I'm not going to, you'll only get 10 of the 12, but I'm going to make a great nation around you. And he's anointed just like David was anointed, just like Saul was anointed by God. But Jeroboam is faithless. Even though he has that anointing, even though he has that selection by God, he's faithless and he leads Israel astray. So, kind of shocking, that you think of these evil kings as like, well, they're obviously just totally outside of anything, had nothing to do with God. But no, God was there. Right at that moment, God split Israel because of Rehoboam's problems. But anyway, so that's a shocker, something we don't normally expect. Okay, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Originally, single scroll. In the Jewish, if you pick up a Jewish Bible, which is just the Old Testament, this is the last book in the Jewish Bible. So they put this book last when they ordered their books of the Bible. And the reason is it's sort of it's a story. So 1st and 2nd Kings is a story of Israel and Judah, both kingdoms. 1st and 2nd Chronicles is much more. I mean, the northern kingdom does come into it, but it's much more just about the Davidic kingdom, okay? And a lot of 1st and 2nd Chronicles is focused on the temple, the building of the temple. And it's, by the way, it extends all the way through the captivity and to the return. To the Edict of Cyrus at the end of the Babylonian captivity, right? And so it's a different book. And the reason I think the Jewish Bible puts it last, and it was ordered that way by the rabbis zillions of years ago, is because it is this remembrance, and it has this incredible focus on the worship of God. And that's sort of like, hey, if you're finishing the story, that's a good way to finish the story. This is what we need to be. We need to remember God's promise, this grand cycle of sin, and then God makes a way and brings them back. And the temple is rebuilt and all of this. And it's a remembrance of that for Jews. It focuses on genealogy. And again, it's very focused on the worship of God in the temple. It also has some nuances of why David selected Solomon to be his successor, even though he wasn't in the line. Well, he was in the line, but he was farther down on the line. He wasn't the oldest son, for example. So they kind of disobeyed primogeniture in that one. So it talks about that. It talks about how David prepped, but Solomon completed the temple. A lot of cool stuff. Ezra, Nehemiah, next book. Originally a single scroll. I say this every time now, right? The book spans about 100-year period really focuses obviously on Ezra and Nehemiah, hence the name. But it does kind of span a broader period of time than just their lives. Those guys were contemporaries. And one is a prophet, and one is sort of the governor of the people who come back. So the key events is the building of the second temple, despite opposition. So the people of the land did not want, Israel had been gone, 50, 60, 70, 80 years. And so the people who were living in Jerusalem for 80 years kind of felt like they owned the place. I get that. And so they're like, okay, you guys just came from Babylon, but what are you doing? This is my town now. But it's the rebuilding of the temple despite opposition of the people who lived there. And then it's the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the walls of Jerusalem despite the opposition of the people who lived there. And so that's the story. But there's concerns. First is crisis of intermarriage. So again, so remember, when people go into captivity, it's not everybody, not all the Jews went into captivity. It was just the intelligentsia. They took all the nobility, they took all the smart guys, they took all the educated guys, and they sent them to Babylon. All the leaders, anyone who could lead a rebellion. They left the common people, right? They left the farmers and, you name it, herdsmen. They get left behind. And then other people are moved in there by these great empires. So again, there's this dislocation of peoples to keep everybody weak. That was the plan. And so eventually, after 80, or in the case of the Northern Kingdom, much longer, so, I can't do math in my head, 250 years, there's all this intermarrying going on. The temple doesn't exist anymore. All the priests are gone. Everything is gone. There's still a remnant of, God always has a remnant. So there's always a remnant of faith. There's always people who remember. But anyway, a lot of intermarriage starts going on between other peoples and the Jewish people. And then these pure Jews come back from Babylon and say, hey, we're in charge now. And all kinds of stuff starts to happen. And intermarriage starts to happen. And God is not happy with that. Because again, intermarriage and mingling with the peoples was what led Israel astray over and over and over again, to put up those temples to Baal and those Asherah poles where they when we get to the prophets, where Israel prostituted itself with these foreign gods, is what the prophets will say. So that's the whole situation. There's all this opposition, and there's all this concern about purity. We've got to be the nation of Israel. We have to be singly devoted to God and not all this other stuff going on. And then, of course, the other thing is religious purity, right? That's the other thing. There's an incredible, in Nehemiah, in fact, we just went through the sermons series on Nehemiah, right? Fairly recently. There's this incredible scene in Nehemiah where they pull out the book of the law and they gather everybody together and they read, and a revival breaks out. People are just smitten to the heart. Like, we've never heard this stuff before. That's the power of the Word of God. Just read. Remember, a lot of people this time are illiterate. You just read to them, and they're moved to the core. Similar scenes in Ezra, right? So incredible religious revival going on as people refocus. And I think in Babylon, it's a prosperous city and whatever until the Persians attacked. But I'm sure they kind of lost their way again. They're just in this incredible secular environment. And Ezra and Nehemiah is about returning to the true faith, returning to the true people. Cool historical fact, right? This is the time when the Samaritans, remember the Good Samaritan and the Samaritan woman at the well that Jesus talks about and interacts with? This is when the Samaritan schism began, right here. The true Jews come back from Babylon. The people who live there aren't happy about it. Samaria is the capital of that northern kingdom, so they're called Samaritans. And they say, hey, we're Jews. Yeah, we've intermarried, but they end up writing their own Bible. They sort of rewrite the first 5 books in the Bible. It's called the Samaritan Pentateuch. And then they found their own religious cult, which isn't based on a temple in Jerusalem, but instead is based on Mount Gerizim, which is in northern Israel. So, and from that time on, it says in the New Testament, Jews have no dealings with Samaritans for hundreds of years. That's the way it persisted. Okay, Esther. How are we doing on time? We're great. Esther is the last book that we're going to be dealing with tonight. Esther is the most controversial book we're going to be dealing with tonight. And why? Because when people talk about Esther, the first thing they always talk about is this is the only book in the Bible where the name of God does not appear. God is not mentioned. And that, as it turns out, I'm doing Esther in my quiet times right now, so I'm an expert on Esther. But there's fasting, there's wearing sackcloth and ashes, there's all kinds of religious stuff that happens, but the name of God is never mentioned. So because of that, Esther's always gets a hard rap, I would say. So for example, it's not quoted in the New Testament, and it is like in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's not in any of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the Qumran community, which made all these Dead Sea Scrolls, didn't like Esther, didn't have the book of Esther in them. However, here's what I will say. The name Yahweh, so remember, Yahweh is 4 consonants, Y-H-W-H, okay? The vowels weren't in the original text, so it's just 4 consonants. Those 4 consonants do appear in the text in acrostic sentences. And so what's an acrostic sentence? What's an acrostic? I don't know. Every boy, I don't know, I can't even remember. I'm from music class. I can't think of an acrostic right now, but, we had God eats popcorn, right? Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Corinthians. Okay, so there are acrostic sentences where the first letter of each word, Y-H-W-H, and it's a 4-word sentence. And there's other sentences where it's the last letter of 4 words in a sentence. Y-H-W-H is the last letter of the 4 words. And those are sprinkled throughout the book of Esther. So it's kind of cool. There's also one sentence where it's I am that I am. The name, the way God names himself to Moses. That is in the text. But they're hidden in there. You can't, and that's sort of a motif of Esther. It's this book. It's an incredible story. They never mention the name of God, but yet God's behind the scenes of everything that's going on right now in the book. So that's kind of cool. By the way, they've searched. The only other place they can find one of these acrostic sentences in Psalm 96. The book's been criticized for other stuff that you can read. Key event is the deliverance of the Jews. So this bad guy named Haman gets upset with one Jewish guy and decides to wipe them all out. and Esther happens to be queen and is also Jewish. And so she risks her life to save the Jewish people. It's a great story. And spoiler alert, the Jews are delivered. By the way, I will warn you, just as a quick aside, you have to be careful with reading this stuff, okay? Years ago, I got a Bible on tape, cassette tape. Yes, I'm old. And I started listening to it on my way to work. And I missed meetings because I get to the parking lot at work, and I'm like, oh, I got to hear just one more chapter. And so it can be career limiting if you start reading this, so just fair warning. Anyway, it's some good stories. Jewish Feast of Purim is based on the book of Esther, and that's probably the key reason why Esther is so revered and why it's in the Bible, is because it's these events. It was a miraculous deliverance of the Jewish people by God. They celebrate it in a feast every year, that incredible deliverance, and so it's the most joyous time. Deliverance is a joyous event overall. All right, so theological takeaways. Theological takeaways. There that is. I wrote a bunch down. I could list out verses, a lot of verses that prove all these points, and you can take them away. But I would just encourage you to read and see if you see these sort of broader themes that are there. First is that you read this stuff and you go, man, God is in complete control of the world and everything in it. The empires are pawns in his hands. He is in complete control. The weather is in his control. You name it. Fire coming down from heaven. Incredible events. Droughts. That's all because of God. We had a drought in Texas years ago, right? We get droughts occasionally. All of that is in the hand of God. That's what these books teach us. And a lot of times we're not so aware of that. We don't ascribe everything to the power of God like these books do. But these books ascribe everything to the power and the will of God. Okay? God desires obedience and heart devotion, and he enables his people to give it. Over and over, all of those cycles through Joshua and Judges and all of the kings into the exile and back out of the exile. God, over and over and over again, says in these books that he wants his people to have a heart devotion, not just pay lip service, not just do their religious duty, but do it with a heart that's turned towards him. And then he enables them to do it. Even when they screw up, even when they sin, he still enables, he still makes a way. People cycle between sin and faithfulness. We've talked about that. We know that. God sends blessing in response to prayer, repentance, faith, and obedience. If people do those things, if nations do those things, then they are blessed in these books. God sends chastisement and removes blessing in response to sin. So when people fall away from God and fall away from their faithfulness, then God responds with chastisement. That's throughout these books. Interesting. Another quick aside. Interestingly, you could read those two. They're clearly in there, but you read them and you go, "Oh well, what I need to do then is I need to pray and be faithful and obey, and then God will bless me." No. There is nothing you can do to make God bless you because God will not be moved by you. He is God. You can't make him do anything. If you think you can make God do something, that now you're in the realm of magic. You pull the wand out and you say the incantation in Latin backwards, and then you command the supernatural to act. That's magic. That's not the way God operates. You cannot move him. But you can ask him to bless you, and he's good and often will say yes. And so all of this prayer and repentance and faith and obedience, really what that is just a life of a request to God. And he may say yes and he may say no. That's his business. He's God. But But anyway, I just want to make that point. But he does over and over again in these books. When people do those things, he responds. And when they don't do those things, he responds. Okay, last thing is God's action is experienced mostly indirectly and alongside our effort and toil. God rarely in these books does he just bless. Always that blessing might come through another hand, or always that blessing comes through the people's own effort and toil, like conquering the land. They had to come up with a plan. They had to fight the battle. And God blessed. So God's blessing comes hand in hand with our effort and toil. It's a mystery on how that all works together. Again, if I effort and toil, God will bless me? No, you can't force God to do anything. But it comes together. I don't sit on my couch, eat popcorn, and say, hey, God, take care of that for me. You know, that would be a bad way to approach God. I read a book once where a guy said, we pray prayers sometimes that say, God, please help me stop sinning. That's a heartfelt prayer, right? And then he said, okay, so liken that to the student says, God, please help me learn Polish. To the student, you'd say, great, pray to God and then get out your Polish flashcards and start learning vocabulary. What do we say to this guy? Okay, other theological points, so just leaving that. Other theological takeaways. God, this is broader. God is working all things for good with those who love him. He can even redeem heinous sins. He redeemed David committing murder and adultery and redeemed that somehow, the fruit of that ends up in the lineage of Jesus. So God can redeem even our worst days. So he can work all things for good. He's working all things for good. Success and joy in life can only be found in turning one's heart to God. That's a really big concept that's in here. And the last one I would say, and this is the teaser, God has big plans for the future. I just pulled out 2 verses here in Samuel. But he hints, even in this period, even 1,000 years before Jesus, he's hinting that he's coming. He's coming. He's coming. And so God, in these books, we know God has big plans for the future. All right, final thoughts. I've got all this detail about a guy named Omri, okay? Omri is the greatest king in Israel, that northern kingdom, okay? And here's why. So first of all, Omri, was a guy who started off kind of out of the scene of power, but worked his way up to be commander of the entire army of the northern kingdom of Israel. So he was a guy who's up from the bootstraps kind of guy, okay? Second is Israel was in chaos. There was a rightful king, a guy who was of the dynasty, and then an usurper came in and took over his, and then he ruled for a while, and then his son came on the throne, but his son was like a party guy and not really serious about being a king, so another guy comes in and kills him, wipes out the whole lineage, and sets himself on the throne. Well, Omri is sitting here watching this going down. He's the commander of the army, and he goes, no, we're not doing that. So he takes his army. The capital city at this point is Tirzah, and he conquers the city of Tirzah in like a day. It's like, that's a problem in and of itself, if that's your capital. So he conquers the city. The other guy burns the palace down around him and kills himself. And suddenly Omri's king, except he's not, because another guy comes up and says, well, Omri, thank you for saving us, but now I'm going to be king. There's a civil war for 4 years. And then finally Omri wins the civil war, and he is the undisputed king. Okay? That's 4 years into his reign. He's got 8 years left. He only reigns 12 years. Over the course of the next 8 years, he builds a new capital city in Samaria. This capital city is one that the army of Israel can't take in a day. In fact, the army of Assyria took more than a year to take it. It's a really powerful capital city. He conquers the Moab, which is one of those kingdoms in the Levant region. He conquers one of those guys, and he conquers them so thoroughly that 50 years later, they're still sending checks to Israel, saying, please don't attack us. And they keep sending the tribute. 50 years. He's a master of foreign policy. So he conquers Moab. He kind of does an alliance with Aram, okay? And which is where Damascus is. So that's in the, well, for me, it's up there. For you, it's up here. Okay? And then to the north, where Phoenicia is, in the Phoenician city-states of Sidon, he gets a political marriage, and he marries his son to the daughter of the king of Sidon, a woman named Jezebel. We know that name. Who is a high priestess of Baal also, her part-time gig. So he's this master of foreign policy. He gets peace on all sides through either military victory or clever alliances. Okay? And so he basically, I mean, think about it. When he becomes king, Israel, they've had 5 kings in 2 years. They're in a civil war. The capital city is destroyed. The palace is burned down. They're in a shambles. And he builds up this country in 8 years after the civil war is over. So in a reign of total 12 years, he builds it up to be a regional power. He builds it up so that for more than 100 years after his death, people call Israel the land of Omri. And long after, nobody in his bloodline is sitting on the throne because there's all these other usurpers that come in. And then the kings of Israel after him are all called son of Omri. Even if they're not a son of Omri, they're called a son of Omri for at least 100 more years. That's like, I put it here, that's like if we called our presidents Hardings. He was president 100 years ago. And if the U.S. was called the land of Warren Harding, because he was such a pivotal figure in our history. Imagine that. But that's what Israel was called, the land of Omri. What does the Bible say about him? So, by the way, all this stuff that I just told you, some of it's in the Bible, but a lot of it's not. Some of it, you have to read the inscriptions of Assyria and Moab and Sidon. You got to read all these archaeological inscriptions to learn about Omri. Because the Bible gives you this much on him and then says, yeah, he's evil. That is a message from these books. How you live your life profoundly matters, and it's not in all your accomplishments. All right, Lori.
Yes, I agree. How many people were sitting there through most of the last hour and a half thinking, if I could know 1/10 of what Glenn knows? So thank you, Glenn. It is not lost on me that to boil everything down into what you just boiled down means that you know this much because you were able to get it all into this much for us. And I'm very appreciative, and I know that you guys are as well. You know, it struck me a little bit as Glenn was teaching how many times we saw sort of as part of God's narrative to pursue us and redeem us, despite the fact that we, as Israel did, seem to like push him back at every turn. God's like, no, I'm trying to save you. I'm trying to redeem you. I've chosen you. I've made you holy. I've set you apart. And we just keep trying to do this. But what occurred to me was from the very beginning when Glenn talked about how Israel was just a little tiny insignificant part of the map, like they weren't even named, remember? He just talked about all the big kingdoms and superpowers around them. And isn't that just like God? Don't we see that throughout the narrative where everything gets turned upside down? Where God uses the smallest, where God uses the most insignificant, where God does things in a way that makes us go, it's not how I thought that was going to go down. And it was just a great reminder of who God is and how he pursues and redeems us in ways that we just never could have imagined if we were writing this story. So thank you very much, Glenn, for bringing that to us. I want to remind you in our last little bit here that our next Institute class, which is Theology Essentials, I almost said Theological Essentials. Theology Essentials actually follows this course. So after this course is over, which is the week before spring break, I think it's the 13th, the next week is off, and the next week, Theology Essentials starts. So if you are ready to jump into that class, which is totally different than this one. If you're ready to jump into that, we would love that. Sign-ups are available. You're welcome to talk to me. Jeff is in the back. Jeff actually sort of heads up that class. And so he could answer way more questions than I could. Okay, we are going to say a quick prayer, mostly for your safety, on the way home. Guys, again, so grateful that you are here. Joey, anything else that I have left out? Okay, let's pray really quickly. God, thank you so much for this time. We do pray for your physical protection as we travel home through the rain and through the cold weather, whether it's near or far. I just pray that you would protect us as we go. And God, would you provide spiritual protection over every person in this family and in this room and the families that they represent as they seek to study and carve out time and dedicate time to understand your story. In Jesus' name, amen.